Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the mind of one of the absolute most brilliant people of the 20th century. But honestly, we have to start by acknowledging that the story of Alan Turing is a deeply painful paradox. I mean, here's a guy who basically laid the groundwork for modern computing, right? His secret mathematical work literally helped save the free world from Nazi tyranny. And yet, the very same society that completely owed its survival to him, well, they ultimately hunted him down, prosecuted him, and systematically destroyed his life. So we're going to unpack the science, the closely guarded secrets, and the profound tragedy of this man's double life.
To really understand where this story goes, we kind of need to start with this incredibly eerie quote from the 1937 Disney movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Now, our sources tell us that Turing had this notorious habit of just chanting this exact couplet out loud. Dip the apple in the brew, let the sleeping death seep through. And sure, on the surface that sounds like just a quirky obsession, but as you'll see later on, this rhyme casts a really dark, fateful shadow over his entire story.
And honestly, that brings us to the core dramatic irony of Turing's life, which is really the main question we're answering today. How does the man who saved the free world end up becoming its criminal? How exactly does a society take its most valuable intellectual asset, a top-secret war hero, and just utterly strip him of his dignity?
When you step back and look at the sheer scale of the contrast, it is staggering. In the span of just a few years, Turing goes from being this elite, top-secret operative trusted with the absolute highest-level intelligence at Bletchley Park to being a publicly shamed criminal, stripped of his security clearance, totally alienated, and subjected to forced physical alteration by the state. But before we get to the tragedy, let's look at exactly what he did to save millions of lives.
Section 1. The Ultimate Secret Weapon.
So the biggest obstacle for the Allies was this absolutely massive number, 150 quintillion. The German military was communicating using this encrypting typewriter known as the Enigma machine, and because it had this complex system of rotating wheels and plug boards, the machine could produce roughly 150 quintillion possible daily configurations. I mean, the German high command was entirely convinced it was unbreakable, and frankly, a lot of the Allies thought so too. But, Alan Turing wasn't the kind of guy to be deterred by numbers.
When Turing first reports to Bletchley Park in 1939, he quickly realizes that to beat a machine, well, you're going to need a machine. So he helps design the bomb. It was this massive, ticking, clattering device that basically automated the search for logical contradictions in the German code. By 1941, they've got 18 of these bombs running. And by 1942, he had completely mastered the naval U-boat Enigma. And we cannot overstate how crucial this was. German U-boats were aggressively sinking British supply ships that were literally starving the island. Turing's decryption meant that Allied convoys could just steer right around the submarines, effectively saving Britain from starvation.
Which leads us to this really wonderful quote from our sources. Frank Birch, who was the head of Bletchley's Naval Intelligence Division, he thought the Enigma could be broken simply because it had to be. But Alan Turing, he thought it could be broken because it was an interesting problem. I love that. It so perfectly captures how his brilliant, eccentric mind worked. He wasn't just looking at a terrifying military threat, he saw a really fascinating mathematical puzzle that was just waiting to be cracked.
Section 2. Decoding the Patterns of Life.
Now, after the war ends, Turing completely shifts gears. He goes from cracking mechanical codes to trying to decode the biological codes of nature itself. He basically wanted to understand how nature builds things. In 1952, he publishes his one and only paper in mathematical biology, and it focuses on what he coined morphogens. These are chemical substances that react and diffuse through tissue to build complex biological forms. Basically, Turing was looking at an embryo and asking, how does a tiny cluster of identical cells somehow know how to grow into the complex, asymmetrical shape of a living creature? He realized that life itself was just another code, right?
His underlying idea was actually beautifully simple, even if the math to prove it was mind-bending. It boils down to 3 steps. First, chemicals within a biological system react with one another. Then, step 2, they diffuse. They spread out at different rates. And finally, step 3, this ongoing interaction destabilizes the whole system, which causes distinct, highly predictable patterns to emerge. He basically mathematically modeled a chemical soup that inherently held the information needed to build living structures.
And it's incredible what these equations could actually explain. He was mapping out the math behind tiger stripes, the dots on a leopard, the spiraling whorled patterns of leaves on a daisy, even the little tentacles on a microscopic hydra. Turing was using early computers to crunch these complex differential equations, predicting exactly how biological patterns form, literal decades before biologists could actually observe those processes at a molecular level. His brain was just operating in a completely different era.
Section 3. The State's Cruel Betrayal.
So while Turing's mind is soaring, figuring out the literal mysteries of nature, his personal life gets violently interrupted. In 1952, his house gets burglarized. And, believing in the justice system, he does what anyone would do. He reports it to the police. But during the investigation, he candidly admits to having a homosexual affair with a young man named Arnold Murray. Now, in the Britain of 1952, this was considered a severe crime. Turing is immediately arrested. He's charged with gross indecency under the exact same 1885 law that they used to prosecute Oscar Wilde decades earlier. By walking into a police station as the victim of a robbery, the state turned him into a criminal.
To avoid going to prison, which, by the way, would have meant losing all his academic positions and being banned from using his beloved computers, Turing accepts a truly horrific alternative: chemical castration. The state forced him into what they called organotherapy, which meant he was given regular injections of estrogen. And the effects were just devastating: complete loss of libido, physical feminization that included breast development, and, understandably, severe depression. The state was fundamentally, chemically altering his physical body.
And this right here, this is the most profound, deeply tragic irony of Alan Turing's life. Think about it. While his brilliant mind was actively discovering how natural chemicals build beautiful living forms out in nature, his own body was being unnaturally and forcibly altered by state-mandated chemicals. The very man who was writing the mathematical equations for how life blooms was literally having his own biology chemically erased by an ignorant institution.
Section 4. A tragic human cost. On June 8, 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his home by his housekeeper. He was only 41 years old. Right beside his bed was a half-eaten apple. Now, even though the apple itself was never officially tested, the coroner ultimately ruled his death a suicide by cyanide poisoning. And remember that quote from the very beginning of the explainer: "Dip the apple in the brew, let the sleeping death seep through." It genuinely seems like Turing tragically acted out his morbid fascination with that Snow White scene to end his own suffering.
But it is absolutely vital that we don't just look at this as an isolated incident. The sources we're looking at highlight a really staggering number: 100,000. That is the estimated number of men who were convicted under those same anti-gay laws in Britain throughout the 20th century. Turing's story might be the most famous one, sure, but it represents this massive, systemic cruelty inflicted on tens of thousands of ordinary people, people who didn't happen to be war heroes or once-in-a-generation mathematical geniuses.
Decades later, society finally tried to make amends. In 2009, the British Prime Minister issued a formal apology. And then, later in 2013, Alan Turing was granted a statutory royal pardon. However, the sources we're reviewing critically point out the context of how this pardon happened. The people petitioning for it explicitly argued that Turing was an exception, basically saying he deserved a pardon because he was this incredible national asset who helped win the war.
And that brings up a deeply uncomfortable truth. Yes, the pardon recognized his exceptional utility to the government, but it doesn't undo his erasure. Furthermore, our sources impartially report the very real criticism that this pardon completely left out the more vulnerable men, like Arnold Murray, who didn't possess Turing's elite rank or status. A society that's willing to pardon a genius based purely on how useful he was, well, it still leaves tens of thousands of other victims completely unacknowledged.
Which leaves us with this final lingering thought. Alan Turing cracked the Enigma, saving millions of lives. He essentially drafted the blueprint for the modern computer, permanently changing human history, and he had just started decoding the very mathematics of biology and life itself. So what you should take away from this explainer isn't just a WWII history lesson. It's a really profound warning about the horrific cost of prejudice. Just think about it. What else might this incredible mind have decoded for humanity had society not destroyed him? Keep that question in mind. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.